Now our next section may be one of the most important sections we cover because it plays a huge role in everything we do within healthcare, from the standpoint of maintaining homeostasis, from the standpoint of how do we treat disease and how does disease manifest. And so what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about transmembrane or membrane transport. Transmembrane, yeah, that works, but membrane transport. We're going to talk about mechanisms of transport that require energy, we call those active transport, and mechanisms of transport that don't require energy, and we call that passive transport. Now, those two names are fairly intuitive. Active transport, I've got to do something. Well, energy has to be expended. Or passive transport, yeah, I just kind of sit and let it do its thing as long as the environment exists or as long as the circumstances exist to allow that to happen. So what you've got to keep track of here is you've got to look at these transport categories, active on one side, passive on the other, and then say, all right, in those two categories, underneath active transport, here are my types. Underneath passive transport, here are my types. And so as it relates to passive transport, we're going to talk about simple diffusion, we're going to talk about facilitated diffusion, we're going to talk about osmosis, and we're going to talk about filtration. And I think, I don't think we reinforce as much with the slides, but one of the things I want to reinforce here is going back to our discussion when we talked about a solution. That when we have a solution, we have two parts to that. We have solute and we have solvent. And by understanding those two and which one we are moving is going to help you understand which type of passive transport you're dealing with. Because in some situations, we're just moving the solute. And in some situations, we're moving that solute with a little bit of help moving it because it doesn't fit our category of moving on its own. And then in some situations, we're moving the solvent. Now remember, in our body, that solvent is water. Okay? And then lastly, we'll talk about, okay, how can we move both and how can that occur? Okay, so are we moving solute? Are we moving solute with help? Are we moving solvent or are we moving both? Okay, so that's how one of the first ways I want you to be able to distinguish these mechanisms from each other. So let's talk about passive transport first in general. So regardless whether it's simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, or filtration, one of the things we have to understand is the fact that we're not requiring energy for these. So we don't have to expend any of our energy-containing molecules, our ATP, and we can move both solute and solvent. Notice if I'm moving solute, it's simple diffusion or facilitated diffusion. If I'm moving solvent, it's osmosis. Filtration, I'm allowing both. So by moving and without the expenditure of energy, it's going to move with the gradient. And remember I used the term earlier, the difference. So with the difference, with the gradient, moving downhill, all of those are descriptors of saying we're going from an area where the thing we're moving is in highest concentration to where it's in lowest concentration. Okay? Now, keep track of that. And let me restate that. Okay? We need to keep track of, we're going to, of the thing we're moving, are we moving solute, are we moving solvent? And we're moving it from where it's the highest in concentration to where it's the lowest in concentration. Again, we're going to move them differently, but we're not going to expend energy to do that. Now, when it goes back to kind of understand how this works, our passive transport, we refer to as what we call our second law of thermodynamics, or entropy. Entropy is going from an area or going from order to disorder. And what we mean by that, it's easily reflected in, for example, your room. Okay? We go from having a clean, organized room to a dirty room with very little energy expenditure. Okay? In other words, you get undressed, you just throw your clothes on the floor. Okay? You get your clean clothes from mom washing them, yeah, you just throw them on your bed. So there's very little energy expenditure, okay, to go from organized to disorganized, from order to disorder. But if you really, gets to the point where, okay, people are pretty upset and you've got to now take that disorder and return it back to order, well, that takes a lot of energy to do that. Okay? So there's times when we get into that situation and when we go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, okay, we're demonstrating that as well. So when we look at simple diffusion as an example of this, we basically take an area of high concentration. Probably a great example to reflect on is taking a glass of water and putting a couple drops of food coloring. We now have an area of, let's say we use blue. We now have an area of concentration that's very highly concentrated with the blue food coloring. And then the remainder of the water that has little if no food coloring at this point. But if we all of a sudden leave for an hour or so and come back, now all of a sudden that blue has evenly distributed itself throughout that water. So we're going from an area of high concentration or low concentration, and we left and it took no effort whatsoever. But what's going on there is atoms and molecules are moving, and because they're moving, they're colliding. And with those collisions, we're mixing things up. And so there was a scientist, Brownian, who noticed after the microscope was developed that there were collisions taking place. I think he was using pollen molecules in water is what he was using. And he noticed, hey, wait a minute, this molecule is moving around. Well, this molecule shouldn't be modal. In other words, it shouldn't have that motility factor. So why was it moving around within that water? And so that's where we get the term Brownian motion, which is the random motion of particles in a solution that just kind of bang into each other. And the smaller the molecule, then the faster it's going to move. The higher the temperature, the faster it's going to move. And so that random movement is simply just diffusion. And in its example, it's a type of entropy where we can be in a room and let's say we spray whatever cologne in the corner of the room or air freshener in the room. So let's say this is a restroom. Okay? But anyway, we spray some sort of fragrance in the room. At the point where that fragrance is released, it'll be in high concentration. Over time, those molecules will evenly distribute throughout the room. Or even dissolving sugar in water. We have a high concentration, and over time, those sugar molecules will evenly distribute. So notice, didn't require any energy, just happened on its own. Went from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, so it went with its concentration gradient. Okay, pretty simple. Okay, so that's simple diffusion. Now, to just add one piece to that, facilitated diffusion is like diffusion, but this is where the molecule requires some help. So a molecule that doesn't fit the criteria of matching the semi-permeable nature of our membrane, because we said that molecules can pass the semi-permeable membrane if they are small, neutrally charged, and lipid soluble. Well, what if they don't fit those criteria? What if they're large, charged, or water soluble? Well, now they have to be escorted. So our ion channels were a great example. Okay? Those ions couldn't move on their own, and so we had to facilitate their diffusion into the cell. Now, we still aren't requiring energy for this. We just simply have the channels that open and the ions are able to move. And so they can move along their concentration gradient. So if it fits the criteria, small, neutrally charged, lipid soluble, we are moving solute passively across that membrane without any help. That's just simple diffusion. If they don't fit those criteria of movement, then we have to have some sort of helper. And so with a channel, for example, we have channel-mediated facilitated diffusion. Okay? But now we're moving something that normally couldn't move on its own. Now we also have some carrier proteins, and we're going to get into more detail on how those carriers work. But glucose is a great example. In other words, insulin is our signaling molecule. Its job is to increase the number of glucose carriers, therefore facilitates the diffusion of glucose into the cell. So hopefully those terms kind of all make sense. And so here's the division between simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. So again, both are passive transport. Both are movement of think about the word, solute across the membrane. It just depends on does it require help or does it not require help. So things that are small, neutrally charged, lipid soluble, they diffuse down their gradients easily across the membrane. Those things that are larger and are water soluble or charged, notice here my ions hanging out over here, then they have to utilize facilitated diffusion if they're going to cross.